My 82-year-old grandmother sat alone at a table set for 16, while my mother toasted on a luxury yacht using her stolen life savings. That night, I walked away from my million-dollar career to drive through a blizzard uncovering a shocking family crime that they never saw coming. The city of Seattle was a shimmering grid of cold rain and neon lights viewed from the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor banquet hall. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and seared scallops. This was the pinnacle of my career. At 32, I was about to be named the youngest senior vice president in the history of the firm. The room was a sea of tailored suits and artificial warmth. Colleagues who had never spoken to me before were suddenly my closest friends, their laughter ringing out with a hollow metallic quality that grated against my nerves. I stood by the podium, feeling the weight of the folded speech in my tuxedo pocket. It was a masterpiece of corporate gratitude, thanking the mentors who had helped me climb the ladder and the family that had supported me from afar. My CEO, a man who measured worth in quarterly dividends, gestured toward me with a raised glass of vintage champagne. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt the adrenaline of victory. Instead, I felt a strange cold hollowness growing in my chest, as if the oxygen in the room was being replaced by a vacuum. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a sharp, rhythmic intrusion into the carefully curated music of the evening. I stepped into a shadowed alcove near the bar to check the screen. The message was from my mother, Gwendolyn Priceborn Hayes, but she kept her married name Gwendolyn Price. It was brief and delivered with a clinical lack of emotion that I had grown accustomed to over the years. She told me that Grandma Tallulah was feeling unwell and had decided to cancel her 82nd birthday dinner. She told me not to bother driving to Bozeman and that everyone was staying home to rest. At first, I felt a wave of genuine concern. Tallulah was the woman who had raised me in the quiet valleys of Montana, while Gwendolyn was busy building her real estate empire. Tallulah was the only person who truly knew the boy behind the executive mask. I began to type a reply asking if I should send a doctor or fly out immediately, but a cynical instinct honed by years of navigating corporate politics made me pause. I opened Instagram instead. The algorithm did not lie, it never did. There, they were splashed across the screen in high-definition betrayal. My mother Gwendolyn and my cousin Greer were not in a sick room in Montana. They were bathed in the golden, honeyed light of the Mediterranean. The background was not a quiet house in Bozeman, but a sleek white super yacht anchored off the coast of Santorini. They were wearing white linen and wide-brimmed hats, holding crystal flutes of champagne that matched the ones being held by my colleagues just a few feet away. The caption, written by Greer, was a jagged blade to my heart, "Living our best lives in the Greek Isles. Family is everything. Celebrating life's true riches." I stared at the screen until the light burned my eyes. I knew that yacht. I knew the cost of a private charter through the Greek Isles. I also knew that my mother had been complaining for months about her tight finances and how she needed to manage Tallulah's retirement funds to keep the family estate afloat. They were drinking $80,000 of my grandmother's life savings, while she sat alone in a darkened house 3 states away, told that her family was too busy or too tired to celebrate her birth. The contrast was suffocating. Around me, the polite chatter continued. My boss was clearing his throat, ready to introduce me. The applause began to build a rhythmic, demanding sound that felt like it was crushing my ribs. They were clapping for a ghost. They were celebrating a man who was nothing more than a cog in a machine that valued profit over people. I looked at the speech in my hand. It was a collection of lies written on expensive parchment. I thought of Tallulah sitting at a table set for 16, waiting for a doorbell that would never ring. I thought of the candles melting into pools of wax and the silence that must be filling her home. A silence far more honest than the noise in this room. And now, the CEO's voice boomed over the speakers. "I give you our newest senior vice president, Wilder Hayes." The spotlight swung toward me, blinding and intrusive. I did not move toward the stage. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the speech. Slowly, deliberately, I tore the paper in half. Then I tore it again and again until the white scraps fluttered to the carpeted floor like artificial snow. The silence that followed was not polite. It was a deadly, heavy thing that sucked the life out of the room. My boss's smile froze, turning into a mask of confusion. My colleagues lowered their glasses, their faces pale under the chandeliers. "I'm going home," I said. My voice was not loud, but in that stunned silence it carried the weight of a thunderclap. I turned my back on the promotion, the title, and the mountain of money they were offering. I walked out of the banquet hall through the marble lobby and into the biting Seattle rain. I did not call my mother. I did not text Greer. I went straight to my car, ignited the engine, and pointed the hood east toward the mountains of Montana. The city lights faded in my rearview mirror, replaced by the deep, honest blackness of the highway. I had 14 hours of driving ahead of me through snow and shadow, but for the first time in 10 years I knew exactly where I was going. I was going to the only person who had ever truly loved me, and I was going to ensure that Gwendolyn Price never had the chance to silence her again. The highway was a ribbon of black ice and swirling white chaos. As I pushed the SUV through the mountain passes of northern Idaho and into the vast, unforgiving darkness of Montana, the world outside my windshield felt like an alien planet. The snow fell in heavy wet flakes that plastered against the glass only to be swept away by the rhythmic, hypnotic beat of the wipers. 14 hours. Most people would call it madness to drive that distance through a winter storm after a full day of work, but my mind was too fueled by a toxic mixture of adrenaline and cold fury to feel fatigue. The hum of the tires against the slush became a background frequency for the memories I had tried to bury under my corporate success. As I climbed higher into the Rockies, I was no longer a senior vice president. I was a 10-year-old boy again. I remembered the long summers in Bozeman, where the air smelled of dry pine and adventure. My mother, Gwendolyn, was always a distant shadow, a voice on a telephone line, or a sharp-suited hurricane that blew through the house between business trips to Hong Kong or London. She was chasing the future, she would say. She was building a legacy. But it was Tallulah who had actually built me. She was the one who had patched my scraped knees with gentle hands and taught me how to read the clouds for incoming storms. While my parents were busy measuring their lives in net worth, Tallulah was measuring mine in the height marks she carved into the kitchen door frame. She was the anchor in a family of drifting ships. The thought of her sitting in that house believing her own daughter was too burdened by her illness to visit made my grip tighten on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. By the time I pulled into the familiar tree-lined street in Bozeman, it was 2:15 in the morning. The town was swallowed by a heavy velvet silence. Street lamps cast long distorted shadows across the snowdrifts. Every house on the block was dark, but Tallulah's house felt different. It did not just look asleep, it looked abandoned. I used the spare key hidden inside the hollow stone by the porch steps. The metal was so cold it bit into my skin. As the door swung open, the air that greeted me was not the warm, cinnamon-scented embrace I remembered from my youth. It was stale and freezing. The house was pitch black. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I used the flashlight on my phone to guide my way. The beam of light cut through the darkness and landed on the dining room. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. The table was fully extended, draped in a pristine white lace tablecloth. 16 chairs were pulled out perfectly spaced as if waiting for a royal procession that had been diverted at the last minute. Crystal glasses stood empty, their facets catching the light like frozen tears. In the center of the table sat a 3-tier birthday cake. The frosting had begun to sag and the elaborate sugar flowers were drooping in the cold air. 16 plates, 16 sets of silverware, and not a single crumb out of place. I followed a faint sound, a soft rhythmic creaking into the living room. There, sitting in her tattered wingback chair, was Tallulah. She was wrapped in a thin, faded quilt, staring out the window into the blackness. She did not have a single lamp turned on. "Grandma," I whispered, my voice cracking in the hollow room. She flinched slightly, her silver hair catching the dim light as she turned her head. Her eyes were clouded with a temporary confusion that slowly cleared into a look of pure, heartbreaking disbelief. "Wilder, is that you, honey?" "It is me, Grandma. I am here," I said, rushing to her side and taking her hands. They were like ice. "Why is it so dark in here? Why is the heat turned so low?" She offered a fragile, trembling smile and pulled her quilt tighter. "Oh, I did not want to waste the electricity, Wilder. Gwendolyn told me that the accounts are very tight this month. She said she is struggling to keep up with the taxes on the house. I have to do my part to save every penny for her. She is working so hard for us." Yet the bile rose in my throat. My mother was sipping $1,000 wine in the Mediterranean while telling this woman she could not afford to turn on a light bulb. I wanted to scream, to roar at the injustice of it, but I forced myself to stay calm for Tallulah. "You do not have to worry about the money anymore," I promised, my voice thick with emotion. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small heavy object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. She pressed it into my palm with surprising strength. "I knew you would come eventually. Maybe not tonight, but eventually. I spent all afternoon polishing this for you. It was your grandfather's. I wanted you to have it for your promotion. I know how much that dinner meant to you." I unwrapped the silk to find my grandfather's gold railroad watch. It was gleaming, polished to a mirror finish. She had sat in the dark, hungry and alone, thinking of my success while the rest of the family was busy erasing her. "I did not go to the dinner, Grandma," I said, kneeling at her feet. "I would rather be here with you." She touched my cheek, her thumb tracing the line of a tear I did not know I had shed. "Then let us have some cake, Wilder. I saved the biggest piece for you." I looked at her so small and fragile in that massive chair, and I knew that the drive was just the beginning. The real war was about to start, and I would not stop until Gwendolyn Price felt the same cold silence she had forced upon this house. The morning light in Montana did not arrive with warmth. It was a pale, surgical gray that exposed every flaw in the house I once considered a sanctuary. I woke up on the sofa, my grandfather's watch still clutched in my hand, feeling a profound sense of displacement. Tallulah was still asleep, her breathing thin and rhythmic. I decided to spend the morning doing what my mother had clearly neglected, bringing order to the chaos. I began in the kitchen, clearing the sagging cake and the untouched plates. As I reached for a stack of napkins in the sideboard, my fingers brushed against a heavy manila envelope tucked behind the fine china. I pulled it out, and the air seemed to leave the room. Inside were final notices from the utility companies and a terrifying letter from the county tax assessor. The property taxes on the ancestral Hayes estate were 4 months overdue. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I dug deeper into the sideboard and found a printed bank statement from Tallulah's primary retirement account. The numbers were stark and undeniable. A wire transfer for $137,400 had been executed 3 weeks prior. The recipient was an entity called Sterling Global Holdings, a shell company I knew my mother used for her real estate speculations. Gwendolyn had not just borrowed money, she had liquidated the entirety of Tallulah's liquid safety net. I felt a surge of nausea. To the world, Gwendolyn Price was a titan of industry, but here, in the quiet of this kitchen, she was a predator. I needed a witness, someone who had seen the day-to-day reality of this house while I was buried in Seattle. I stepped out the back door, the snow crunching under my boots, and walked toward the small cottage next door. Mr. Abernathy, a retired history professor who had lived there for 40 years, was already on his porch meticulously clearing ice. He looked at me, his eyes sharp behind thick spectacles. "I wondered when you would show up, Wilder," he said, his voice a low gravel. "I saw your car last night. I assume you found the bills." "I found them, Mr. Abernathy," I replied, my voice shaking. "How long has this been going on? My mother told me she was taking care of everything." Mr. Abernathy set his shovel down and gestured for me to follow him inside. His living room was filled with books and the scent of pipe tobacco. He went to a small wooden desk and pulled out a shoebox. Your mother is a very convincing woman, Wilder. She told the neighbors that Tallulah was losing her mind. She said that you had gone no contact, and that she was the only one left to bear the burden. But Tallulah, she is a haze. She is tougher than people give her credit for. He reached into the box and pulled out an old-fashioned handheld microcassette recorder. She came to me 2 months ago. She was terrified not of losing her money, but of losing you. She asked me to keep this safe. She said that if anything ever happened to her, I was to give this to you, and only you. I took the recorder, my hands trembling. I pressed the play button. The scratchy audio filled the room. It was my mother's voice, but it was not the polished maternal tone she used in public. It was a jagged, poisonous hiss. "You will sign the transfer, Mother," Gwendolyn's voice rang out. "Do not play the martyr with me. You are old, and you are becoming a liability. If you do not sign these papers, I will have you declared incompetent by the state. I will put you in a facility in Great Falls, and I will make sure Wilder never finds you. I will tell him you died in your sleep. Do you understand you are a ghost already? Sign it." Then came Tallulah's voice, not confused, not fading, but crystalline and heartbreakingly steady. "I will sign your papers, Gwendolyn. Not because I fear the facility, but because I will not have you poisoning Wilder's mind more than you already have. Take the money. Take the house. Just let me stay here long enough to see him one last time. That is all I have left." I sat in Mr. Abernathy's armchair, the recording looping in my brain like a death sentence. The betrayal was far deeper than I had imagined. Tallulah had not been a victim of her own fading mind. She had been a victim of her own boundless love. She had allowed herself to be robbed, silenced, and isolated just to protect the fragile possibility of my return. She had played the part of the confused old woman to pacify Gwendolyn, a silent martyr waiting in a darkened house for a grandson who had been too busy chasing a title to notice his world was being burned to the ground. The illness Gwendolyn had described was a lie. The loss of memory was a weapon used to discredit the only person who knew the truth. "She knew everything," I whispered, the realization cutting through me like a blade. "She knew," Mr. Abernathy confirmed. "She was not waiting for a party Wilder. She was waiting for a savior. She chose to suffer in silence rather than risk you losing your career in a family scandal. She loved you more than her own dignity." I stood up, the gold watch in one pocket and the recording in the other. The rage I felt was no longer hot. It was a cold, calculated thing. Gwendolyn Price thought she had erased her mother. She thought she had manipulated me into staying away. But she had underestimated the strength of the woman who raised me, and she had forgotten that I was a haze too. I walked back to the house, looking at the silent, snow-covered roof. The time for drapes and quiet conversations was over. Gwendolyn and Greer were celebrating in the Greek Isles, believing they had won. They had no idea that the ghost in Bozeman had just found his voice. The following Monday, I drove Tallulah to a modest brick building on the outskirts of Bozeman. Inside, we met with an estate attorney who had no ties to my mother's real estate network. As the attorney reviewed the microcassette recording and the bank statements, his face hardened into a mask of professional outrage. Within 3 hours, he had filed an emergency petition to freeze all accounts linked to Sterling Global Holdings and Tallulah Hayes. The legal trap was set, and the bait was the one thing my mother could not live without: her liquidity. The reaction was instantaneous. 24 hours later, the quiet peace of the Hayes estate was shattered by the screech of tires. A black luxury SUV roared up the driveway, kicking up slush and gravel. Gwendolyn Price and Greer stepped out, their faces no longer glowing with the Mediterranean sun, but contorted with a frantic, desperate rage. They did not knock. They burst into the living room where Tallulah and I were sitting by the fireplace. "How dare you!" Gwendolyn screamed, her voice vibrating the window panes. She threw her designer handbag onto the lace-covered dining table, the same table where she had left her mother to starve in the dark. "You come back here after a decade of silence, after ignoring every holiday and every birthday, and you think you can freeze my assets? You are a thief, Wilder. A common thief trying to scavenge from a family you abandoned. I stood up, keeping my body between them and Tallulah. The money belongs to her Gwendolyn, not to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, not for a yacht in Greece. You stole $137,000 from your own mother. Greer stepped forward, her expression clinical and cold. She opened a leather portfolio and pulled out a document stamped with a medical seal. Wilder, you are out of your depth. You do not understand the reality of the situation because you have not been here. We have been managing Tallulah's decline for years. She slid the paper across the coffee table. This is a formal psychiatric evaluation. It was conducted 6 months ago. It clearly states that Tallulah Hayes suffers from advanced cognitive impairment and is unable to manage her own affairs. Gwendolyn is her legal guardian. Your emergency petition is a violation of a standing court order. I looked at the document. It was signed by a doctor in Great Falls who I knew had a long-standing business relationship with my mother's development firm. It was a forgery of the truth, a legal fiction designed to erase Tallulah's humanity. She is not impaired, I said, my voice low and dangerous. She has a recording of you threatening her. Greer laughed a sound as sharp as broken glass. A recording of a woman diagnosed with dementia. Any judge in this county will see that as a desperate fabrication or the ramblings of a confused mind. Do you really think anyone will take your word over a certified medical professional over the woman who just donated $50,000 to the Bozeman Children's Hospital? That was the moment the true depth of the betrayal hit me. As I looked out the window, I saw a neighbor, Mrs. Gable, walking her dog. She looked toward the house and then quickly turned away, her face filled with disapproval. My mother had played the long game. She had spent a fraction of Tallulah's stolen wealth to buy the loyalty and the conscience of the town. To the people of Bozeman, Gwendolyn, Price was the saintly daughter struggling with a difficult, fading mother and a greedy, absentee son. "Everyone knows you, Wilder," Gwendolyn whispered, stepping closer. "They know you only care about your career in Seattle. They have seen me at the charity galas. They have seen me caring for this house while you were off making your millions. If you push this, I will destroy your reputation. I will tell your firm that you are harassing an elderly woman for her inheritance. You will lose everything." I felt a wave of sickening helplessness. I looked at Tallulah. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the fire. She looked exactly like the broken woman the medical report described. In that moment, I realized that my corporate training, my logic, and my bank accounts were useless against the narrative my mother had built. Greer was a lawyer who knew how to manipulate the system, and Gwendolyn was a performer who had convinced the entire community that she was the victim. "You should leave, Wilder," Greer said, her tone mockingly sympathetic. "Go back to Seattle before you do any more damage to your grandmother's health. We will handle the accounts from here." The silence in the room was suffocating. I felt the weight of the gold watch in my pocket, the only honest thing left in a room full of lies. I was standing in the house where I was raised, surrounded by the people who shared my blood, yet I had never felt more like an outsider. The town believed the lie. The law was being steered by a fake report, and for the first time I wondered if my drive through the snow had been for nothing. I was a man with the truth standing in a world that preferred a comfortable deception. The Gallatin County Courthouse was a building of cold stone and unforgiving echoes. As I walked down the center aisle toward the petitioner's table, I could feel the weight of 100 judgmental eyes on my back. The gallery was filled with the residents of Bozeman, the same people who had been fed a steady diet of lies by my mother for years. Gwendolyn sat at the opposing table looking every bit the grieving, dutiful daughter in a charcoal wool suit, her eyes cast downward in a display of practiced humility. Beside her, Greer was a shark in silk, her briefcase open, her documents arranged with lethal precision. The Honorable Judge Whitaker, a man whose face was etched with the weariness of 30 years on the bench, looked over his spectacles at the assembly. "We are here to determine the validity of the emergency guardianship and the disputed asset transfers regarding Mrs. Tallulah Hayes," he announced, his voice dry and authoritative. Greer wasted no time. She stood with the poise of someone who had already tasted victory. "Your Honor," she began, her voice echoing with artificial sincerity, "my client has spent the last decade as the sole caretaker of this estate. We have presented medical evidence of Mrs. Hayes' cognitive decline. More importantly, we have here a revised will and a power of attorney signed by Tallulah Hayes 3 years ago. These documents grant Gwendolyn Price full authority over all financial and property matters. Mr. Wilder Hayes is a stranger to this house, a man who chose his career over his kin and is now attempting to hijack a family's legacy for his own gain." She walked toward the judge's bench, handing over the folder. Gwendolyn wiped a stray theatrical tear from her eye. The courtroom whispered in disapproval toward me. I felt the walls closing in. My own attorney looked at me, his brow furrowed. We had the recording, yes, but Greer had already begun to argue that it was the incoherent rambling of a confused woman manipulated by me. "Your Honor," I said, standing up. My voice was steady, grounded by the cold, hard gold of the watch in my pocket. "Before you rule on the validity of the documents signed 3 years ago, I ask the court to examine the foundation of this estate. I ask you to look at the original last will and testament of my grandfather Silas Hayes, filed 40 years ago." Greer rolled her eyes, a condescending smirk playing on her lips. "Your Honor, that document is ancient history. It has been superseded by multiple updates." "Not according to the law of Montana," I countered, stepping forward with a yellowed iron-pressed parchment I had recovered from the wooden box in the attic. My grandfather was a man who understood the nature of his family. He knew the character of his daughter Gwendolyn long before she became the woman she is today. I handed the document to the bailiff. "Please look at page 12, section 4, the protector clause." The courtroom went silent. The scratching of the court reporter's keys was the only sound. Judge Whitaker flipped through the brittle pages until he found the section. His eyes narrowed. He read in silence for what felt like an eternity. "For the benefit of the court," the judge said, his voice dropping an octave, "I will read the clause aloud. To ensure the preservation of the Hayes family home and the core retirement fund, I, Silas Hayes, stipulate that these specific assets are held in a secondary trust. No transfer, sale, or encumbrance of these assets shall be legally binding without the tripartite signature of my wife, Tallulah Hayes, and my grandson Wilder Hayes, provided he has reached the age of 25. This clause is immutable and cannot be waived by any subsequent power of attorney unless Wilder Hayes is deceased or legally incapacitated." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a trap snapping shut. Greer's smirk vanished. She grabbed her own copy of the files, her fingers trembling as she scanned the fine print. Gwendolyn's face went from saintly humility to a mask of pure, ashen terror. She had spent years manipulating her mother into signing papers, believing that Tallulah was the only obstacle. She had forgotten, or perhaps she'd never known, that her father had seen through her greed 4 decades ago. He had placed the keys to the kingdom in the hands of the 10-year-old boy she would eventually try to cast out. "Mr. Hayes," the judge looked at me, "did you sign any transfer of funds to Sterling Global Holdings 3 weeks ago? Did you sign any deed transfer for the Bozeman property?" "I did not, Your Honor," I replied. "I was not even aware these accounts existed until 4 days ago." Judge Whitaker slammed his gavel down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. "Then the law is clear. Every document signed by Gwendolyn Price regarding the Hayes estate over the last 3 years is not just disputed, it is null and void. They were executed in direct violation of a standing testamentary trust." The judge turned his gaze toward Gwendolyn, his eyes flashing with a cold fury. Furthermore, the evidence of coercion provided by the microcassette recording, combined with the illegal bypass of this trust, suggests a systematic pattern of elder fraud. I am referring this matter to the district attorney for immediate criminal investigation. Bailiff, please escort Mrs. Price and her counsel to the clerk's office to surrender their passports. The gallery erupted. The neighbors who had whispered about me moments ago were now staring at Gwendolyn in horror. She tried to stand her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. Greer was already packing her bags, her loyalty to my mother evaporating the moment the word criminal was mentioned. I looked back at the gallery. Mr. Abernathy was there nodding slowly, and in the very back row Tallulah sat. She was not crying, she was not shouting. She simply stood up, adjusted her cardigan, and walked toward me. The war was not just won, it was over. The legacy Silas Hayes had built was safe, and the woman who had protected it with her silence finally had her home back. As Gwendolyn was led out through a side door, she looked at me one last time. There was no love in her eyes, only the bitter realization that she had been defeated by a man she thought she had erased. The dust from the courtroom settled slowly, like the spring snow melting into the roots of the valley. Justice had been served, but the real victory did not happen behind a mahogany bench or under a judge's gavel. It happened in the quiet mornings that followed. The neighbors, who had once turned their heads in shame, now walked up the porch steps with casseroles and sincere apologies. They had seen the truth, and while the betrayal of my mother still lingered like a faint bruise on the heart of the town, they chose to see Tallulah for who she really was, the pillar that had never crumbled. I did not return to the glass towers of Seattle. I resigned from my position as senior vice president, much to the shock of a firm that could not understand why I would trade a corner office for a mountain view. I set up a small desk in the spare bedroom, working remotely as a consultant, listening to the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine in the other room. Those months were the most valuable of my life. We did not talk about the trial or the money. We talked about the garden, the books she loved, and the stories of my grandfather that she had kept tucked away for a rainy day. When spring finally arrived, painting the Montana meadows in shades of violet and gold, Tallulah slipped away. She passed in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, her hands folded peacefully over the quilt she had sewn for me decades ago. There was no pain, no fear, only a profound, silent release. She died knowing she was loved, knowing her home was safe, and knowing that she was no longer a ghost in her own life. In accordance with her final wishes, the $137,400 that we successfully recovered from Gwendolyn was not deposited into my bank account. Instead, it became the seed for the Silas Hayes Memorial Scholarship Fund, providing opportunities for local children who once dreamed of worlds beyond the mountains. The house remained mine, but its doors were now open to the community she had cherished for 82 years. As I sit in the kitchen tonight, lighting a single candle on the table where she once waited for a family that did not come, I realize that inheritance is not measured in currency or real estate. It is measured in the promises we keep. My mother thought she could buy happiness with my grandmother's life savings, but she ended up with nothing but a cold, empty reputation. I learned a difficult lesson on that frozen highway. Love is not a curated photo on Instagram or a polite toast at a promotion dinner. It is the 14-hour drive through a blizzard. It is the decision to show up when everyone else has found an excuse to stay away. It is the quiet act of lighting a candle for someone who spent their life keeping the flame alive for you. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, or if you believe that the elderly in our lives deserve to be seen and protected, please let me know you are with me. Drop a comment below saying, "I am here," or "for Grandma." Your connection is what keeps these stories alive. Until next time, remember to choose the people who chose you first.